Hello and welcome to Miguel Delaney's Inside Football edition 6 of this videocast, if you want to call it that. That is a complement to my newsletter of the same name, which you can sign up to, and my general work for the Independent. And it will, of course, explore the wider significance of the headlines, the football news cycle and match weeks. And please be sure to comment and like and subscribe and all of that if you enjoy the content. And this week I am going to discuss something wider than I've been discussing so far, which is basically the way the game is played and how we might be entering into a period of huge change and something we haven't really seen for 16 years. So it's interesting. I was talking to someone at a club the other day who was saying they're having a discussion with one of their senior players. This is quite a high profile player. It's a major club. And they were lamenting how the player this is, that so much of modern football is duels, duels and duels. They have noted how that's already quite a change from even 3 years ago, 2022-23, which was still all about finesse, control, speed, transitions. And that so much more of it now is battles. And of course, the classic example of this is maybe the most old-fashioned battle we've seen in the Premier League of late, which is Erling Haaland and Gabriel. I mean, that is actually a classic centre-forward, centre-half battle, duel, if you want. That I remember sitting in a press conference in 2014 where Arsene Wenger, who was actually at that point lauding the qualities of Luis Suarez, he was talking about how those sort of confrontations or collisions had gone out of the European game because it had become so homogenised. Now, of course, what was the main reason it was homogenised? Well, that was really, you can pinpoint it to 2008 and Guardiola's rise as the manager of Barcelona, and specifically the immense success he had, sensational success he had with a very specific ideology. That ideology, of course, is known as juego de posición in Spanish, the positional game. And it amounts to everything we've seen over the past 16 years, which is control of the ball, control of space, use of high technique with a high press. So again, high rates of possession, playing very high up the pitch, total dominance really to reflect how it's a reinterpretation of total football. And that type of football became so successful and so influential to the point, of course, that Guardiola changed English football on his arrival in 2016. You only have to look at how so many teams right through the pyramid have passed the ball from the back outside the 6 years. And it should be pointed out how this was not normal even as recently as 2016. And since 2016-17, just as an illustration of this, long goal kicks have dropped every single season until now. Because, of course, what happened with that was, I think by the 2022 World Cup, we got to a point where the Guardiola approach was it was so much considered best practice, basically, that you had to play this way to have any chance of success, really, because most of the best sides played this way, that everyone started to do some version of it. You could say the game became tactically stale to the point that in June of this year, Thomas Tuchel, who I suppose now has a bit of a brief as England manager where he can stand back and consider these things a bit more because he's not intimately involved in the club game, he was talking about how he was getting bored by the modern game because so much of the Premier League last season involved so many of the same sides playing the same approach where play was built up through the right back. Now, when that happens, or when something like that happens, it does mean that a sport or anything really is rife for innovation or any sort of deviation to take effect. And I think we started to see maybe the first signs of this in the 2022 World Cup when Argentina won it with Lionel Scaloni, the manager, willing to trust much more in the individual instincts and creativity of his team. Because obviously one of the things that's defined the Guardiola era is highly systemized football, where so much of what teams do is prescribed and rehearsed, and there has been this sense that players have got more robotic in that. Now, of course, the grand caveat with Scaloni's Argentina is they had Leo Messi. I mean, that's some player to trust as regards individual inspiration. But I think what's really striking is that given Tuchel said that in June, and by September, to last month, which is what, 3 month difference, he had suddenly noted how so many old-fashioned qualities had come back. He was talking about how, long goal kicks had come back, throw-ins, set pieces, all these issues we've been discussing this season. And I think the way Tuchel was struck with that shows, I think, the drastic rate of change. And of course, you couldn't have a more drastic sign of change than the fact that Guardiola himself went to really the polar opposite of the ideology that has defined his career. And in that 1-1 draw against Arsenal in mid-September, he really played the approach that someone who had been considered his tactical opposite, Jose Mourinho, played against him at Inter Milan in the Champions League semi-final in 09-10. So just like Mourinho in that game, Guardiola went for essentially kind of a 5-4-1, a mass defence, really looking to congest their box and congest the space around it. With Haaland, this superb individual, almost kind of whacking the ball clear of his own area as much as surging through in the Arsenal goal. Now, it can't really be overemphasised how in 2009 or 2010, when that game took place, nobody would have been able to imagine that Guardiola himself would come up with a system like that. And I think what's really interesting here, so this video cast isn't another discussion of how we're now in a this video discussion isn't yet another about how we're now in a post-Pep world. I think that's been discussed a lot now, not least in the first few minutes here. But it's more about what next, because I think the really interesting thing here is it's almost like football's end of history moment. That's potentially a bit of an overly academic way to talk about something as trivial in football, especially given the theme of what that refers to. So that, of course, is the political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who famously wrote an essay at the end of the 1980s that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War was the sign of the final victory of liberal democracy. Essentially, that liberal democracy was going to be the political system that dominated the future. Now, as we've seen from the last few years, as Fukuyama himself admitted in 2019, that was wrong. And in the same way, I think this is football's end of history moment, because for the last 16 years, such was the spread of Guardiola's football that it felt like that nothing could really break out from this. That this was the way if you wanted to succeed, you had to play something like this way. And what's really interesting here is that suddenly we're in a world where there's no best practice, because this is no longer the best practice. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that. Guardiola himself, interestingly, has touched on some of them. One of the main reasons is exactly this issue, the push-pull of the tactical arms race over time. So once everyone does something in a certain way, there's an obvious edge if someone tries something different. It's new. And also there's an element that people or managers and teams forget how to solve problems that used to be easy to solve. One of them being how you deal with long throws, which previously had big centre halves heading them away. And like one of the great discussions in football over the past decade has been about how those classic centre halves don't really exist. Well, maybe this might condition them to come back. But there's another massive element to it that Guardiola really picked up on, which is the calendar. And something, again, we've discussed in The Independent a lot, how football is eating itself, how we're seeing it in every single competition, every single area of football. All we're ever seeing is expansion, more games, and often fewer stakes from those games, or lower stakes. They don't mean as much. And what the effect that has had essentially is it isn't giving coaches enough time on the training ground to do properly sophisticated things. Also, it's causing fitness issues, so players aren't necessarily at the condition to properly play that pressing possession game, the positional game. This is what Guardiola was getting at. I think Arsenal had a particular issue here last season where, Arteta is one of Guardiola's supposed great disciples in that way. And he found he had to be more pragmatic or compromise because he was missing so many of his best attackers throughout the season. So hence Arsenal had such a focus on set pieces. So yeah, I think they're two of the most obvious examples about how football is changing. So we've gone from a systemized game that was really based on a lot of short passing and intricate play, trying to open opposition defences, whereas suddenly, I think, for the moment, it feels like coaches have gone down one of two directions. One is greater trust in individual talent in a way we've not seen for some time. I think that very interestingly, that's the angle that Liverpool have gone for. You can see it in how much they've spent on elite attackers this summer. Even if some of those attackers haven't necessarily shown they're elite yet for Liverpool, I think there's other reasons for that. Not least actually adapting to Slot's system. And then the other is set pieces, long throws. Now, I think there's also something fascinating there, because obviously Arsenal have been maybe the most prominent practitioners of the latter. And that shows how the way football might go isn't necessarily, a kind of that it might be the next ideological battle between individual talent or set pieces. We might well have a meld of the two. Because at Arsenal, I know they would say that this isn't actually a deviation from the positional game, but almost a natural evolution from it. And by that, I suppose, I mean that, they mean, is that if you're in a situation where you are trying to play your normal build-up game against a newly massed defence, because there are more of those. This has been another trend of this season, that a lot of the leading teams, at least outside the Premier League, they have much less possession and play much more counter-attacking football than any point over the past few years. And this is beginning to seep into the Premier League as well, obviously. But Arsenal are top of the league right now. They've got like a percentage. They've got a possession average of around 57%, which is it's classically Barcelona high. But if you're in that situation, you're playing against a mass defence. Obviously, it's newly difficult to break down those defences. And what happens? There are ricochets, blocks that result in throw-ins, corners, and free kicks. And this was basically the realisation that Arsenal had in that way. And I think why they've been almost kind of pioneers in this set-piece approach. Because if suddenly you face a lot more set pieces, well, it's better to actually start honing those set pieces. And that's exactly what we've seen. Now, I suppose the issue there is the further or the more you do that, the further you start to get away from, this classic ideology. So even if you still want to play it as Miguel Arteta does, in a way that Guardiola doesn't necessarily want to do in the same way anymore, then you will also just score many more times from these new deviations, particularly set pieces. And I think what's really fascinating about this is that it does mean that there are no guarantees right now. That suddenly, all of football has been framed and conditioned by certain approaches, right down to how young players and young talent is trained. And now suddenly, a little bit like what football found 10 years ago, where suddenly you had, a lot of centre halves who were being asked, or goalkeepers being asked to play from the back in a way they weren't used to. Well, now suddenly, after kind of a decade of coaching that way, we might see a regression as well. And I think it's going to create a lot of unpredictability and uncertainty in the Premier League this season. Also, it might create innovations. But I think it's something that wasn't really expected. And it's one of those things that has suddenly just exploded, not quite out of nowhere, because you could see the seeds being planted, as I mentioned, kind of what Scaloni was doing with Argentina, what Areola was doing last season with Bournemouth, and especially that trust in players to dribble. But now, very quickly, and I think much more quickly than I or anyone else in the game seemed to expect, there's been drastic change, and that change is suddenly seeing a reversion to a lot of old qualities, and particularly a lot of duels. So players say they have to be primed for duels and physical battles, much more, say, than running up and down at intense or at great intensity, as had been the case for the last 5 years. And so, it might be a much more physical Premier League, and maybe actually both a return to some of the Premier League's history, so maybe not quite an end of history in that sense, but also respun for a new future. And it could well dictate how this season goes. Thank you.